Hello and welcome to today's lesson on the dangers of radiation, which is part of the atomic structure topic in GCSE Separate Science physics. So in today's lesson, we're going to look at the dangers of radiation. So, if we've been successful and learnt in today's lesson, we should be able to state the basic properties of radioactive emissions. We should be able to describe the different dangers of radiation, and we should be able to understand the possible impact on the human health due to radiation. So in today's lesson, we're going to be covering the following part of the AQA physics specification, 4.4.2.4 radioactive contamination. Now consider the following radioactive nucleus. In the previous lesson, we've considered the concept of radioactive decay. Now the point of the decay is to increase the stability of the nucleus. So a radioactive nucleus is unstable, it will decay and become more stable. Now nuclear decay is based on probability, like tossing a coin. You can predict how likely it is to happen, and a measure of how quick a radioactive decay occurs in it is called its half-life. The half-life is the average time it takes for half of the unstable nuclei to decay and become stable. So the half-life is the average time it takes for the activity of the sample to half. The half-life is the average time it takes for the count rate of the sample to half. Now, when a substance does decay, it can give off either alpha, beta or gamma waves. Now, we must consider what effect that alpha, beta and gamma have when they encounter humans and other living organisms. Now, the impact of radiation on human health has been a major topic of research in physics and has led to many different scientifically published reports on the impact of radioactive emissions. So, for example, there's been a scientific report to the United Nations on the effect of nuclear radiation. There's been a scientific report on the impact of nuclear radiation to Japanese children to the Fukushima disaster. There's been a scientific report by the Australian government on the effects of radiation. There's been a National Research Council report on the impact of radiation on human health. So why is it important for the findings of the studies into the effects of radiation on humans are published and shared with other scientists? Well, this is needed so that the findings can be checked by peer review and are reproducible, can be produced by other scientists. Now, to understand the impact of radiation on human health, we've got to understand what the word means. So what is the definition of radiation in physics? Well, radiation actually has two different definitions in physics. The first definition is that radiation can be electromagnetic waves which are emitted, transmitted and absorbed by objects in the universe. So for example, visible light or ultraviolet or radio waves, and we cover these concepts in paper 2. But the second definition is that radiation can be the nuclear radiation released by an unstable nucleus as it becomes more stable, such as gamma, alpha and beta. Now, gamma waves can be classified as both electromagnetic radiation, definition 1, and nuclear radiation, definition 2. Now, electromagnetic waves or nuclear radiation which can damage human cells is called ionizing radiation. So certain types of high frequency electromagnetic waves can be ionizing, such as X-rays and ultraviolet radiation, but all types of nuclear radiation is ionizing radiation. Now, all types of nuclear radiation can have a damaging impact to human health. So radiation, especially nuclear radiation, has a stigma of being thought of as highly dangerous. So you are told to be careful when handling radioactive material. Why is that? What can radioactive materials do to the human body? What disease can radioactive materials cause? Well, the proper name for this type of radiation is ionizing radiation. So when the radiation particle or energy hits an atom, it can knock an electron out of the atom. So the atom becomes an ion. Now this process is called ionization. So the release of an electron from its structure turns an atom into a positive ion. Now the larger the radioactive emission, the more likely it is to ionize an atom. So the larger the radioactive emission, the larger the ionizing power. So alpha particles have the highest ionizing power, whilst gamma waves have the lowest ionizing power. Now alpha particles are likely to knock electrons out of the atoms as they are so massive, whilst gamma waves are unlikely to knock electrons out of the atom as they have no mass. Now ionization can happen to your DNA in your cells because it's just made out of atoms. So ionization can cause your DNA to mutate, which can lead to cancer development. So ionization of atoms can lead to mutations in the DNA, which can lead to a cancerous tumour forming. Now, all ionizing radiations can cause cancer to develop, however it's down to chance. Now, as any exposure to ionizing radiation can lead to cancer, there is no safe level of radiation exposure. Now, this effect is called stochasticity, which is that there's always a chance of the event occurring. So this means that all ionizing radiation has some chance of causing cancer in humans, however the likeliness of this varies. So the concept of stochasticity is an advanced idea and is beyond the GCSE specification, but the chance of ionizing radiation given a human cancer is measured in sieverts. Now, an exposure of 1 sievert gives a human a 5% chance of developing cancer. Now, 1 sievert will cause illness if absorbed all at once, and 8 sieverts will result in death even with treatment. So the value of sieverts depends on the dose of radioactive emission and the type of radioactive emission. The value of sieverts also depends on the part of the body where it takes place. So for examples, the genitals are very sensitive to ionizing radiation. Now, a high dose of alpha particles will lead to a large sievert value in the human. So this gives a greater chance of ionization and a greater chance of cancer. Now, when an object is exposed to ionizing radiation, we say it is irradiated. Irradiation is the process of ionizing radiation passing through an object. So irradiation leads to the possibility of ionizing, mutation, and cancerous tumours developing. Now, examples of irradiation can include X-ray imaging and radiotherapy. Now, if an object is irradiated, it does not become radioactive itself. Once the ionizing radiation has passed through the material, there is no longer any effect. Now, materials can also be contaminated if they're coated in unwanted radioactive nuclei. Now, these nuclei will decay over time and release nuclear radiation. So over time, these radioactive nuclei decay into stable nuclei. When this occurs, the radioactive nuclei emits radioactive emissions like gamma, alpha, or beta. So we know that in this example, this material is contaminated, so the radioactive nuclei on the material can release radiation, which could harm the object. Now, once a material has become contaminated, it is now radioactive until the unwanted nuclei has been removed. Now, contamination of a material can lead to long-term irradiation, and this irradiation would happen at a very close distance because the unstable nuclei, the radioactive nuclei, are on the actual object. So this means a contaminated object will receive a high dose of radiation, which would increase the chance of harm. Now, the irradiation due to contamination would occur at very close distances, which means that there will be no shielding of any radiation. So again, would increase the chance of harm. Now, it's important to know that contamination leads to a greater chance of cancer developing compared to irradiation. Now, examples of large-scale radioactive contamination have occurred when nuclear power stations have exploded, such as the Fukushima disaster in 2011. Here, radioactive nuclei have been released by the power station and they've settled on the topsoil and contaminated the surrounding area. So all the topsoil needs to be removed before people can move back to Fukushima. So we know that this is contamination as the radioactive nuclei are not wanted on the topsoil. Now, another example of a large-scale contamination was when the Chernobyl power station exploded in 1986. Here, radioactive nuclei have been released by the power station and have settled on the topsoil and the contaminated area and contaminated the surrounding area. Now, the Ukrainian government have decided to let the radioactive nuclei naturally decay because they have a very long half-life, so it will take a long time to decay to the background level. So even today in 2019, 2020, Chernobyl cannot be inhabited by humans permanently. So let's just recap what we've learned so far. There are two main dangers due to a radioactive material. Irradiation, which is when an object is exposed to ionizing radiation, but the object itself does not become radioactive. You've also got contamination. That's the unwanted presence of radioactive nuclei on a material where these decay and give out radiation. The object does become radioactive, it is in fact contaminated. Now, ionizing radiation can lead to ionization, which can lead to mutation, which can lead to cancer in humans. So all ionizing radiation is dangerous, and all ionizing radiation has the chance of causing cancer. Now, increasing your dose of cancer increases your chance of cancer. So we can look at the possible doses a human can receive, which is measured in sieverts. Now, like mentioned before, 1 sievert gives a 5% chance of developing cancer in a human. Now, you could be asked to express dose in other units. So other units of dose include the Gray, and even in the 2018 physics examination, students were asked to convert sieverts into what we call the banana equivalence index. Now, the dose due to the background radiation is always much lower than levels which typically lead to cancer. However, there's always some slight chance that background radiation can cause cancer. Now, the dose received varies from human to human due to their location and their occupation. Now, many engineers and scientists work with ionizing radiation, including radiographers, nuclear power station workers, aviation engineers. Now, this occurs as they have increased exposure due to cosmic rays as they're higher up in the atmosphere for longer periods of time, and military engineers are another example of people who use ionizing radiation. Now, how do these engineers and scientists reduce the risk of contamination and irradiation when they're working with ionizing radiation? Well, a worker who uses ionizing radiation can reduce their exposure by, firstly, keeping as far away as possible from the source of radiation. Workers should never directly handle radioactive sources and point them away from the body. Now, using tongs will prevent contamination and minimize irradiation. The second precaution is spending as little time as possible in areas with a high background radiation. So workers are only allowed to spend short amounts of time in areas with radioactive materials, which will again reduce irradiation. Now, precaution number 3 is shielding themselves from radiation with lead or concrete barriers. Now, here the source is encased in lead to reduce the emission of ionizing radiation, because lead will block alpha and beta radiation and will also reduce the effect of gamma emission, so will reduce irradiation. Now, in fact, many hospital walls have lead-lined walls as it reduces irradiation for patients and visitors. So workers who use ionizing radiation reduce their exposure and receive dose by keeping as far away as possible from the source of radiation, spending as little time as possible in areas of high background radiation, and shielding themselves using either concrete or lead barriers. Now, even with these procedures in place, people who work with ionizing radiation will receive a dose of radiation, and this must be monitored to ensure it's not a large dose. So people will wear badges which will monitor exposure to radiation. If the person receives a large dose of radiation whilst they're working, their badge changes colour. Now, if the badge changes colour, then the person who's received a dose which is too high has been notified of this, and they're then asked to work away from the radioactive sources. Now, let's summarise what we've learned in today's lesson. Radioactive contamination is the unwanted presence of materials containing radioactive atoms on other materials. The hazard from contamination is due to the decay of the contaminating atoms. The type of radiation emitted affects the level of hazard. Now, irradiation is the process of exposing an object to nuclear radiation. The irradiated object does not become radioactive. Now, students should be able to compare the hazards associated with contamination and irradiation, and suitable precautions must be taken to protect against any hazard that a radioactive source used in the process of irradiation may present. And you should also be able to understand that it's important for the findings of studies into the effects of radiation on humans should be published and shared with other scientists so that the findings can be checked by peer review. So, if we've been successful and learnt in today's lesson, we can state the basic properties of radioactive emissions, we can describe the different dangers of radiation, and we can understand the possible impact on the human health due to radiation. So I hope you've enjoyed today's lesson on the dangers of radiation, which is part of the atomic structure topic in GCSE Separate Science Physics. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson and have a lovely day.